Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us to tonight's session in our series, History of Israel and Palestine. This is an additional session that we put on at sort of shortish notice to deal with current affairs to a degree. Because while we were going ahead with our series, the whole idea of conscription came back. That's really been in the news a lot lately. And not just in Britain, I should say, also in Germany, there's a huge debate. Should you have conscription, etc.? We'll discuss tonight, is this really about conscription? Is conscription feasible? Is it perhaps from a communist point of view, a good thing to get arms into everybody's hands, etc., etc.? But we'll also look, of course, at the drive to World War III, which really is what we think behind all this talk about conscription. Very pleased that Ian has prepared an opening. So without further ado, over to you. Thank you, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. In January, the Minister of Defence, Grant Shapps, said that, a quote here, "We are moving from a post-war to a pre-war world." And on the 24th of January, General Sir Patrick Sanders, Chief of the General Staff, effectively head of the army, was quoted in an article in the Times arguing that the British Army recruitment simply can't keep up with the numbers of personnel leaving. The current army strength of 74,000 is likely to fall to 70,000 in 2 years. He went on to propose that Britain should train a citizen army of around 120,000, consisting of, I quote, regular reserves and a strategic reserve of former service personnel who can be recalled in time of emergency. The distinction between volunteer reserves, formerly the Territorial Army and the Royal Naval Reserve and the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, now they're all just called the something or other reserve, and regular reserves is an old one, and I'll say more about that later because it's an interesting distinction. I'm sure that General Sanders is also aware that the Minister of Defence already has the power to recall former service personnel in time of war, if they're under 55 and have served within 18 years in the army and 6 in the navy. So imagine that you joined up for 3 years in the hope of getting your heavy goods vehicle license, and if you don't read the small print, within 18 years of having left, you could be recalled to the colours. The following day, after this thing was reported in the Times, in a letter to the Times, the former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO, General Sir Richard Shirreff, added his support, adding that the British Army would have the greatest difficulty, quote, coming to the aid of a NATO ally. With, quote, personnel numbers in freefall, the cost of expansion by volunteers is likely to be out of the question, even if the numbers of young men and women needed were prepared to come forward, which is unlikely, unquote. The concern isn't confined to the USA, into the UK, as Tina has said. In Germany, SPD Defence Minister Boris Pistorius has said that Germany must be prepared for direct confrontation with Russia. Inspector General Carsten Breuer has supported that in an interview in Welt am Sonntag, and talked about the need to, quote, ensure that the armed forces are able to grow so that we can hold our own in a war. While nobody seriously believes that Russia is going to invade the UK, the possibility of an escalation in the war in between Russia and Ukraine is a real one, particularly given the rates of attrition of Ukrainians means that Russia is regaining ground lost in the last 2 years and consolidating its hold on predominantly Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine and the strategically important Crimea. It's a major port for the Black Sea. And if to reinforce the urgency of the situation, the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War, Exercise Steadfast Defender, is currently taking place all the way from northern Norway to Greece. That involves 90,000 NATO troops, including 20,000 from the UK and 25,000 from the USA. And that's likely to continue until May. I don't wish to alarm anybody, but May is a good time normally to start a campaign. Then there's the whole genocidal war being waged by Israel on Palestine and the Houthi support for the Palestinians, leading to shipping being diverted away from the Suez Canal, which is likely to draw in Royal Navy vessels with Royal Marines and RAF aircraft into the Red Sea. So what is the likelihood of any UK or German government, or any other for that matter, being able to introduce conscription, and how useful would those conscripts be? Should we be mobilizing to resist it now? And what is meant by a citizen army? And what attitude should socialists take to a citizen army as opposed to a professional army? Spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that we should absolutely be mobilizing to oppose a future war. But I'm going to argue that the likelihood of Britain in particular, perhaps, of successfully mobilizing significant numbers of people as conscripts is a bit far-fetched. And I'll go on to explain why. I'm going to make some reference to military and veteran mental health, which is which used to be one of my research and teaching topics, because I think not so much because it's rates of psychiatric disorder are any higher in the military than anywhere else. In fact, they're usually lower. But because I think it's a key indicator of some of the problems that the British Army in particular will face, and I suggest that the British Army isn't that unusual from that point of view. Generally speaking, the bourgeoisie prefers a professional army. It prefers a committed army, which is generally reasonably well paid and well resourced. Feudal armies were often billeted on local populations and often received their reward by plunder or whatever else. A modern professional army is a feature of the coming into being of capitalism. Not that no one has recognized the importance of a political commitment to the cause, as it were. Oliver Cromwell, in talking about the appointment of officers to the new model army, famously said that he would prefer a plain russet-coated captain who knows what he fights for and loves what he knows. And as people who are familiar with the history of the 17th century and the English Revolution in particular, political tensions existed in the new model army to the extent of sections of the new model army being radicalized to extend the franchise and to abolish not only the monarchy but the House of Lords and a whole range of other kind of reforms that Cromwell subsequently wasn't prepared to allow. So generally speaking, the bourgeoisie prefers a professional army. And the attitude of Marxists has been, well, the attitude of Marx and Engels was that effectively a professional standing army is an army which can be an adjunct to the bourgeoisie's domination and rule over the proletariat. In looking at the drive to World War III, we're looking at a world in which there is the decline of capitalism. The USA in the 1950s hardly needed to exert its influence purely by force. It was a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity in the United States. At various other times, Britain too has been able to enforce its will, not by just sheer violence, although the threat of violence is always there when you have a professional standing army. But what we're seeing is the decline of capitalism in general and the decline of the USA relative to, for example, China. And China really is the main enemy as far as the USA is concerned. Arguably, what's taking place in Russia at the moment and Ukraine is a proxy war being waged by NATO in order to ensure that Russia is subjugated before it takes on the real enemy. As far as the USA is concerned. I put there a two-front confrontation. The reason why I did that is because of course, when you think about the First World War, the von Schlieffen Plan was concerned with the danger that Germany faced fighting a war on two fronts, Russia on the one side and France and its allies on the other. And one could argue that what the USA is doing is ensuring that either Russia is tied up in an unwinnable war that is draining its resources, or that it can be suitably vanquished. A Ukraine could be incorporated into, if not NATO directly, then into the what we might call the US sphere of influence. And of course, that has been the great fear of Vladimir Putin from the outset. So the question is what's the likelihood then of this being of it escalating further? I don't think it's very likely that Russia has any hope whatsoever of occupying the whole of Ukraine. It is almost certainly going to consolidate its hold over the predominantly Russian-speaking parts of the Ukraine it currently occupies. The question is NATO going to be prepared to sit and watch whilst Ukraine is bled dry? And what are the prospects of a casus belli, a cause being either manufactured or existing by chance for a full-scale assistance of Ukraine? And how does this tie up, for example, with the forthcoming election of Donald Trump? In looking at the Middle East, of course, now this is predominantly about the whole question about whether Britain can actually bring in conscription. I'm not convinced it can. But in looking at the Middle East, of course, it has added a new complexity. To what extent, for example, is involvement in British troops going to be necessary at any point, for example, in Yemen? The likelihood is that most of it will be done at one removed, whether by air attacks or whatever else. And we know, for example, there have been threatening noises with regard to Iran in terms of Iran's support for the Houthis, Hezbollah, and so on. What are the chances of Egypt being destabilized by what's taking place in Palestine, and indeed Jordan too? It is interesting that Jordan was one of the countries most vociferous in supporting South Africa in terms of its action in the international court, looking at whether Israel is perpetrating genocide. So let's have a little think for a moment about what we mean by a citizen army, or at least what Marxists think about as a citizen army. Some of you will have seen pictures like this before. The Paris Commune of 1871, really just a matter of weeks in which the French National Guard, which had been radicalized, of course, different parts of the National Guard from different arrondissements, whether they were middle-class ones would be more likely to simply support the Republican government, whereas more working-class arrondissements were thoroughly radicalized. But in the Civil War in France, Marx learns this as it's one of the most important lessons that Marx had learned, and it's one of the few things that caused him to subsequently revise anything within the Communist Manifesto. Here we have something which is not a professional standing army. It is effectively the workers in arms, male and female, and under democratic control, and in a commune where workers' representatives are paid no more than the workers they represent, and those representatives being subject to recall. So there's the possibility here of a kind of democratic control over the French National Guard, which Cromwell had obstinately refused to countenance in the new model army. World War I, one could argue, was something a citizen army. And bourgeois historians of World Wars I and II will often argue that, in fact, what you have is the mass mobilization of the entire population, which, of course, is true on one level. That's it, World War I. Again, as I mentioned, it was born of a fear of a two-front confrontation on the part of the German High Command, but it was also born, of course, on competing in imperialist interests between Britain and Germany. And at the time, the British Army, and in fact, at the height of the British Empire, the British Army was never more than 300,000 strong. So in 1914, for example, the British Army was about 270,000 plus 60,000 reserves. But what was considered separate was what was called then the Territorial Force, subsequently later called the Territorial Army. And the Territorial Force, which came into being in 1908 as a kind of rationalization of all the different militia bodies that had constituted the reserve forces before 1908. So different county militias, often with the local Lord Lieutenant of the county, who would be the Colonel in Chief, that kind of malarkey, was rationalized and enlarged and called initially the Territorial Force. It was originally recruited and set up for home defense only. So it took over the militia role. So for home defense, and of course putting down revolutions. I mean, the massacre of people in Tolpuddle, in St. Peter's Fields in Tolpuddle, sorry, in St. Peter's, the Peterloo massacre in St. Peter's Fields in Manchester was perpetrated by a militia controlled by a local landlord, effectively. But the Territorial Force was to be something else. It was to be a part-time professional reserve, predominantly for home defense and putting down the possibility of revolution at home. It's not accidental that Aldershot is where it is, or that the barracks of the Household Cavalry are in the middle of London, along with the whole of the Household Division. There has always been a need to station soldiers near large urban conurbations, which are seen as the potential breeding ground of revolutionary activity. What's often overlooked is that conscription was not introduced until 1916, January 1916, before conscription. In fact, at the early part of World War I, the War Office was overwhelmed by the number of people who were volunteering to go. The reason why the Black and Tans were so called in the Irish War of Independence was that there were these strange people who would turn up with a black jacket and brown trousers, or vice versa, and the black, or what was more widely known as Kitchener blue, were the temporary uniforms that were issued to the thousands of men who had volunteered, and there simply weren't enough khaki uniforms, not least of which because the color khaki was, well, embarrassingly made in Germany. And so a lot of the early recruits were kitted out in blue uniforms. So conscription not introduced until 1916, and not at all in Ireland. And notwithstanding that, thousands of Irishmen, or Protestant and Catholic, volunteered and fought in the trenches of the First World War, even though the Republican movement's motto was neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. And of course, the Indian Army, which was pretty much 1 million strong by the end of the war, also was a volunteer army. But by 1918, in World War I, 3,820,000 was the strength of the British Army. A lot has been, I'm going to mention something here about people who were executed, either for the majority. There were 3,080 people who were sentenced to death. Only around 346 were actually shot at dawn. About 25 of those, 27 of those were people who were shot for things like murder, or murder and rape, or things that they would have been hanged for in civilian life. It's often thought that somehow hundreds of shell-shocked victims were marched off to be shot and so on. Relatively few. There were some, of course, cause celeb, poor Private Harry Farr and others, but notwithstanding that, there weren't really that many. Of course, 346 is brutal enough, and most of them were executed for desertion in the face of the enemy, casting away weapons, and a number of other capital offences in military law at the time. Only some were found subsequently to be possibly suffering from what was then known as shell shock. Actually, there were, at the outbreak of the war, there were no army neurologists or psychiatrists. There was nobody who could give a professional view on the matter one way or the other, and simply relied upon general duties medical officers of the Royal Army Medical Corps. By September 1917, there was a significant mutiny at Etaples. And of course, there were mutinies in the French army, which led to the removal of Nivelle and his replacement by Marshal Pétain, subsequently Marshal Pétain. So the reason why I mention it is because can you imagine anybody being shot for desertion today, let alone shot for doing something that might be construed as a result of shell shock? Other examples of citizen armies are interesting to have a quick look at. This isn't really the time to discuss them in any detail, but I did want to mention the Soviet Red Army because on the face of it, it was a workers and peasants Red Army established in January 1918, founded by the Council of People's Commissars and under the leadership of Lev Trotsky. June 1918, Trotsky had ended workers' control and the election of officers. People who I've known in the past who are more anarchistically inclined was saying, well, it's a good example of what Trotsky was like. But put yourself in Trotsky's position at the time. The Tsarist army had been reduced to about 10 million by desertions. Around 2 million had deserted. Many other units were functionally useless from the point of view of being willing or able to fight, not least of which because many of them had no weapons at all. So effectively, the people's militias, the workers' militias that existed, were merged with the army. This was predominantly still officered by Tsarist officers, and most of the soldiers were of peasant stock rather than proletarians. Arguably, what Trotsky was having to do was make the best of a bad job and turn it into something resembling more closely a bourgeois army for the sheer purposes of being able to prosecute the war at all. But it wasn't really, whilst there were significant elements of it that were in the leadership, and certain regiments, the machine gun corps, for example, were resolutely proletarian. And politicized to support the Bolsheviks. But nevertheless, Trotsky was in the position of having to make the best of a bad job in terms of trying to turn an enormous army to fight the white armies and incursions of so many other different countries trying to crush the young Soviet Republic. Let's also remember the Spanish Civil War. The Popular Front government had won the election in February 1936, which was promptly followed by a coup by the Spanish army. The Spanish army was pretty evenly split. The generals were, of course, wanting to overthrow the Popular Front government and restore order, as it were. Franco, who had been posted to the Canary Islands, was actually in an ideal position. By being posted to Canary Islands, he was effectively outside of the supervision of the Republican government. And the basis for the support of Franco's army actually came from Spanish Morocco. If you recall, in George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, one of the things he said was, why on earth did the Republican government not immediately declare Spanish Morocco to be liberated, to be independent, because that would have undermined his cause instantly. Hugh Thomas, who's a historian of the Spanish Civil War, argued that simply arming the workers immediately would have been a way in which the insurgent generals could have been brought to heel very, very quickly indeed. Of course, the Spanish Republic had support from the USSR and Mexico, from the USSR, but not without a cost. It had to be paid for. The weapons were actually paid for by Spanish gold. But the fascists, of course, also had militias. The CGT, the POUM, the anarchists, CNT, FAI, all had militias. Anyone who's familiar with Homage to Catalonia will know that George Orwell didn't join the international brigades, not until later anyway, when he tried but didn't. He was actually in the POUM militia because he'd been a member of the Independent Labour Party, and they had fraternal relations with the POUM. He was on the verge of trying to join the international brigades, which were founded in 1936 under the aegis of the Communist International. But before he could actually join, having been wounded, the POUM was suppressed, and in the end he took a side, and he took a side on the side of the POUM and on the side of the Spanish proletariat. The point about the Spanish Civil War, of course, is this isn't time to discuss it in any detail, but it was another example of politicized armies, armies which were effectively the workers in arms. And arguably, one of the things that was a feature was that as these militias were incorporated into the national army of Spain, far from being more effective, they were less effective. There's a reason why I've put the cast of Dad's army on here. I'll explain. The British Army in 1939, regular and reserve, that is to say territorial and regular, was 892,697, including my dad. Conscription was introduced in 1939, and by 1945, 3 million had served, and it was numbered 2.9 million by 1945, but 3 million had served in the British Army effectively. When one looks at psychiatric casualties as a kind of index, as it were, of something going on that's related to perhaps resistance within the context of a military operation, psychiatric casualties were between 10 and 30%. They varied depending on the theatre of war. They depended upon the nature of the warfare. In the First World War, it was artillery versus infantry. And if you've got to sit in a trench for hours and hours with shells landing all around you, that's got to be pretty stressful. By contrast, psychiatric casualties in North Africa, a war of movement involving a lot of tanks, didn't necessarily incur a lot of psychiatric casualties. What's interesting, though, and we'll see it later when we come to look at the Gulf War and the Iraq War, is that psychiatric casualties didn't necessarily occur in the places where you would most expect it. They didn't necessarily occur among people who were in the front line. Men who were discharged home in World War I with shell shock sometimes had been nowhere near an exploding shell. They'd actually been somewhere in the rear of the military formation, and the same pattern was seen in World War II. And it's also worth remembering that the approach to psychiatric casualties changed over time. In World War I, people in 1914, 15, 16 were often sent home, and then the likelihood of getting them to come back to military service was remote. After that, treatment stations were set up close to the front, and people were treated close to the front and with the expectation that they should go back to work. And that became the official army doctrine from World War II up to the present, that you're treated as close as possible to the point of psychiatric wounding, as it were, with the confident expectation that you'll return to work. But none were executed in World War II. No one was executed for desertion. No one was executed for who was apparently shell-shocked. And quite often people who came down with what came to be known as battle fatigue or a range of other kind of diagnoses, semi-pseudo diagnosis, were often ended up serving in rearward positions rather than just simply being sent home or discharged altogether. The reason why the cast of Dad's Army is here just is me being playful, but it's not widely appreciated that the Home Guard was founded by a communist. If not actually founded, then inspired by Thomas Henry Wintringham. Those are his dates, 1898 and 1949. He sadly died of a heart attack at the age of 50 odd. Had served in the Royal Flying Corps as a mechanic and as a motorcycle dispatch rider, and then subsequently in the International Brigade. He joined the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1923 and helped to establish the Daily Worker as its daily newspaper. Because he had served in Spain, on return, what he wanted to do was train 100,000 strong to resist invasion. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the War Office wasn't too keen on the idea of 100,000 people trained by a communist in guerrilla warfare, being in any kind of senior position. Wintringham actually started training volunteers before the foundation of the local defence volunteers, which was what the Home Guard was called before it was called the Home Guard. Wintringham himself broke with the Communist Party over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and subsequently founded the Commonwealth Party, not as in the British Commonwealth, but Commonwealth, and it was a socialist party which existed up until the end of the Second World War. Why I think conscription is a non-starter is to look at, firstly, no one was shot for desertion in the Second World War. Who would they shoot? If there was an attempt to conscript an unwilling population, I can assure you, and the British government has said much the same thing, and so have other senior army officers, that actually what they don't want is conscripts, because conscripts are going to be more trouble than they're worth, and they're not necessarily going to be particularly good soldiers. So let's have a contrast, for example, between Gulf War I and the Iraq War. Gulf War syndrome is a whole complicated area in its own right, and I don't mean to trivialize it here. I don't deny for one moment that there are people who went through very real and may still be suffering horribly as a consequence of their service during the Gulf War. But there were a number of important factors that were isolated, some of which are in the literature and at least one which isn't. One is the pattern of vaccines. Before being dispatched to the Gulf, they were vaccinated for absolutely everything, including botulinum toxin and anthrax and God knows what. And of course, a whole series of vaccinations, all within a week, is a significant assault on the body's immune system. They were also exposed to depleted uranium. There's a suggestion that organophosphates were used in the Gulf War, and of course, every soldier would have been issued with pyridostigmine bromide tablets, so-called NAPS tablets, which are a prophylactic measure for preventing the possibility of being killed by nerve agents. And you take those, and then if you're exposed to a nerve gas, you inject yourself with atropine. So those are the things that are talked about in the literature. One of the things that wasn't really talked about was the use of the regular reserve. If you recall, early on, I said this general was General Sheriff. Which one? Sheriff? No, the other one. General Sir Patrick Sanders had been talking about there being, as it were, three types: regular, reserve, and soldiers who could be just brought back at short notice who had previously been service personnel. The majority of the reservists that were mobilized in the Gulf War were called regular reserves. They were people who had not read the small print. They had signed up for 3 years in the hope of getting their HGV license, and they hadn't realised that they would be eligible for recall to the colours at short notice in wartime. So all of a sudden, somebody who hasn't been anywhere near the military for 10 years suddenly gets his call-up papers and has to turn up. And he hasn't trained, he isn't fit, he isn't even remotely prepared, and isn't remotely interested, and certainly doesn't particularly want to die for Queen and country, or king and country as it will be now. I'm not suggesting for one moment that is what constitutes Gulf War syndrome. I'm suggesting it's another factor, another thing in the pot. Because something that was interesting in the Iraq War, for example, there wasn't really an Iraq War syndrome. There were lots of people who suffered as a result of their service. There were lots of people who had what we might call PTSD. Now, PTSD itself is interesting. It came into being as a diagnostic category in 1980 as a mean in the Diagnostic and Statistical the American DSM-3 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as a means of treating the veterans of the Vietnam War without a proper diagnosis. People manifesting with psychiatric symptoms such as long-term alcohol abuse, short-temperedness, all sorts of other bits and pieces, depression, anxiety, and so on, as a direct consequence of their military service, couldn't be treated because they didn't have a diagnosis. And PTSD was formulated as a diagnosis for that very purpose, so that they could receive funding from the Veterans Administration. And of course, having made it into the DSM-3, it very quickly made its way eventually into the International Classification of Diseases. So there wasn't an Iraq War syndrome in the same way. Now, why? Is it, for example, that the pattern of vaccines was changed, which is undoubtedly true. There weren't quite as many, and they weren't quite as close together, and so on. Was it that they hadn't been exposed really to organophosphates in quite the same way? Because they were all still taking their NAPS tablets, that's for sure. And but one other thing that's quite interesting was that they were different reservists. These were volunteer reserves. They didn't just round up people who'd been in the army 10 years ago and say, oh, off you go, son. There's the small print. Here's a uniform. Here's a rifle. Far from it. What they did was approach what was then the territorial army and say, who fancies going to war? And what was called intelligent mobilization. And so most of the reservists who volunteered because they wanted to go, because going to Iraq and possibly being shot at by Iraqis was better than working for, I don't know, Staffordshire University or wherever. But there were very similar kinds of mental health casualties. Now, this is notwithstanding the fact that they're both relatively short and wars. But what was also interesting, of course, is that in the Iraq War, one of the things that was noted was that the psychiatric casualties were higher among the reserves. This is notwithstanding the fact that the reservists were generally older, of higher rank, generally better educated, partly because of the distribution of reservists. So lots of medics and doctors and various other people who would be in the reserves, and so all factors which normally mean that your mental health will be better, but there were higher rates of psychiatric casualties among reservists than there were in the regulars. I want to suggest that one of the reasons for that is there's a kind of resistance. Given that you're stuck doing something that you really don't want to do, one way is to go sick. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone was making it up or anything of the sort, but the kinds of stresses that you're put under as a regular soldier who's committed to doing it is different from if you're all of a sudden pitched in as an individual augmentee into a unit where you don't know anybody, where and your status is really quite low as a reservist. And what was interesting was that, for example, lots of the casualties weren't among infantry soldiers who'd been having firefights with insurgents. Far from it. They were cooks, storemen. They were people in what are otherwise known as combat service support duties. They weren't frontline troops. They were the troops who mended the rifles if they were broken, or fixed the Land Rovers or whatever. And these were the people who were turning up in military regimental aid posts with psychiatric symptoms. So and actually, the interesting thing was there was a resonance between that even and the First World War, where soldiers who hadn't been anywhere near an exploding shell were reporting sick. So all I'm saying here is that the likelihood of conscription being employed is remote, because for all the grandstanding that's been taking place in among these generals in the Times and Grant Shapps, for all their grandstanding, there is still no appetite, as far as I'm aware, for the idea of having lots of young people with no wish whatsoever to be in the armed forces and no wish whatsoever to die in Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter. The likelihood of Russia invading Poland or invading the Baltic republics is fanciful. I mean, given what they couldn't do in Ukraine, the likelihood that they could overrun Poland or Austria or Germany or anywhere else is just absurd. And similarly, I would argue the likelihood that I may be wrong here and I may be falsely eating my words, but the likelihood that the United States would go to war if China did invade Taiwan is again questionable. And the likelihood that China would invade Taiwan is questionable. It certainly hasn't made any obvious threats in that direction. And what it has always asserted, that it wanted a peaceful reunion of Taiwan with the rest of China. What are some other reasons possibly why people aren't joining the British Armed Forces? I'm suggesting that the reason is it's actually not a very good job. That at various points, I was telling Tina before this started, my cousin had been a career soldier. And for him, it was a good life compared to working down a coal mine, or a good life compared to working in a factory. He got to go and spend time in Germany. He got to go and spend time in Gibraltar. The idea of going somewhere warm and dusty for months on end is remote. And I'll just mention here a little thing. Psychiatric casualties were higher in US forces than in British forces. What was interesting is that a lot of the diagnosed rates of psychiatric disorder were higher before deployment in US forces than British forces. And that may well just simply be a feature of the way the diagnoses are applied. But it may also be something to do with the fact that US forces, for example, were deployed for a year at a time. And in that time, they would get 2 weeks R&R. They would go home for 2 weeks in a whole year. And some of them who'd been deployed for a year subsequently had that extended to 18 months. British troops, by contrast, were allowed home for 2 weeks in a 6-month tour of duty. So the total UK armed forces today is 152,400, with a further 32,280 reserves. These are slightly dated. There has been a massive campaign to recruit, which hasn't necessarily worked very well. So 2023, more left the armed forces than joined, and that's been true for almost all but 6 years since 1999. The proportion of women has increased, and I would argue, as a socialist, that's a good thing. But the reason why women have increased is largely because men can't be recruited. And what I suggest is happening is a little bit of it's good pay compared to what other jobs that women are doing is, rather like nursing. And of course, the comparative rates of pay for different uniformed services is quite an important subject. For example, in 1918, before the police strikes in Liverpool and London, the police officers were paid commensurate with unskilled manual labour. After the strikes of 1918 and 1919, their pay was tied to skilled manual labour. And if you look now at police officers' pay, it's starting to slide and become sort of roughly around the rate of, say, a trained nurse on about 33,000. Or, as I sometimes put it, not bad pay for women's work, given that there is a 20% deficit in women getting paid about 20% less than men, despite the Equal Pay Act and all the rest of it. And if you look at here, also the very large numbers of Commonwealth recruits in the British Army, something like 38% are recruited from Commonwealth countries. What's the likelihood of people who've come from Commonwealth countries wanting particularly to die in Ukraine in a war which has, I mean, the reasons for joining the British Army, if you're from Zimbabwe, are that you get a first world rate of pay and that you can at least send some home. But for example, the pay for a trained soldier at the moment, 23,500 compared to 21,500 for working in Little. Army officer, 37,500 compared to a little warehouse supervisor of 60,500. And all that compares with, say, a trained nurse of 33. Finally, then, what does that then tell us, for example, if we look at these questions around reservists and regular soldiers, what does it tell us about, for example, the Israeli Defense Force? The Israeli regular service is 32 months for men and 24 for women. The professional soldiers, the permanent service, are a different group in a sense. But once you've done your regular service, you're then a reservist. And generally that reserve service is about a month a year. In the British Army Reserve, for example, it's 27 days a year. But as I understand from what I read, in Israel, not everybody turns up to do their reserve service. So the active personnel in the Israeli Defense Force is around 170,000, with nearly 500,000 in reserves. Of the reservists, 360,000 were mobilized after the 7th of October. And of course, 300 assault rifles were distributed to West Bank settlers almost to use as they wish. And so far, official estimates quoted in the Times of Israel is about 556 killed in the IDF. Other estimates I've seen are about 650, and possibly around 6,000 out of 30,000 Hamas fighters have been killed. But what we're seeing in Gaza is the kind of fierce house-to-house fighting in built-up areas. Where the defenders know the land, and although I'm not putting forward any argument here that the IDF will be defeated, what we will see, I think, is a growing list of casualties on both sides. But remember, there were 3 million Vietnamese killed as a result of the Vietnam War, and there were 58,000 US personnel killed, and the USA lost the war. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Comrade. That was a really excellent, wide-ranging opening, and thank you for putting all that work in. I do hope you type it up as well or transcribe it so we can have a little article after that, because that was a lot of very useful information. Comrades, if you have questions or want to make a contribution, etc., please click raise hand and I'll bring you in. To get the ball rolling, a couple of points perhaps that we could discuss, and that is the idea of the attitude of communist socialists to the army, and you did touch on that. Just thought we could have a little quick standalone discussion on that. So it's interesting that the reserve army was set up by a communist. So he clearly thought it's a good idea to have people with arms. A lot of lefties will shudder at the thought of it's guns kill people, etc. We don't want guns, we want peace, etc. But our opponents, our enemy, they have all the guns. They have no problem using them. So socialist communists do want the people armed, don't they?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's been a discussion about this in Weekly Worker, of course, and it's one of the reasons why I find I can support that position. There's no doubt about it that a standing army, as we saw, for example, in the Spanish Revolution, is a way of keeping the working class under control. That's why it's there. Yes, it's there to support British or American or whoever, any other imperial ambitions, but it's also there to make sure the working class stays in control, under control, and from that point of view. And actually, even the founding of the young American Republic envisaged that a well-ordered militia was the best way of ensuring that government did not become a tyranny. The way that that's been translated, of course, is that everybody should be allowed to have an M16 in their living room if needs be, and that somehow that's a democratic right. But that certainly wasn't the way in which even the American Constitution was written. I would argue that a proper workers' militia, including having some kind of disciplinary function, you wouldn't just hand out guns to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. You would want to ensure, just as the Bolsheviks did, in fact, that you were handing it out to workers who were committed to maintaining socialism. And in the end, the other aspect of it, which I find important, and the reason why I mentioned kind of things like rates of pay for all the uniformed services, is that actually we're not looking today at a hugely privileged section of the population. My attitude towards uniformed services is fraternize at every opportunity, and because in the end we have to win them over. In the end, the fate of Salvador Allende awaits us all if workers take power, and there has to be some way of reconciling workers maintaining power with a standing army. There can't be a standing army except for the specialists that you need to train people. However, it does depend on the context. I mean, it has to be remembered that Switzerland effectively has a citizen army. Every male of military age, they've always been a bit backward in Switzerland on the question of gender. Every male has their service weapon and uniform at home in the cupboard. That doesn't make it socialist, obviously, but I think it's a measure of the security with which the bourgeoisie feels in Switzerland that they can allow that. The question is, could Britain or the United States going to war trust its population with a huge citizen army? My guess is not. And my guess is also that the relatively few people will join. The other thing to mention, of course, is the reserve army of labour affects the army. The army gets quite good recruits when there's high rates of unemployment and low rates of pay, and it suddenly becomes a bit more attractive joining the army or Navy or Air Force. It's interesting to note, incidentally, there are differential rates of good mental health in the different services. The healthiest of them is the Royal Navy. And one of the reasons for that is there's almost nobody with no qualifications. I mean, everybody's very well qualified and trained and whatever, and there aren't the same kind of contacts. But the next most healthy is the Royal Marines. And that's interesting because they're likely to be in the thick of fighting. But look at them. They're selected in the first instance. They have a high status, high rates of social cohesion. They're not the cooks and the drivers, and that plays a part in their morale. So, yes, I'm completely in favour of a citizen army.
So you're saying that actually the bourgeoisie, their talk about conscription it's like a PR gag, isn't it? It's part of the drive to war, which will not be fought with a conscripted army. But us, we probably would, have some benefits from a conscripted army, a people's army of some sort, if
I
you
mean,
were democratic control, but it would give you opportunities to work as saboteurs, etc., to fraternize, to try and split the army.
Friedrich Engels put his year in the Prussian artillery to very good use in the revolutions of 1848, and became, as you know, a military expert, really. And some of the finest writings of Engels are on military matters, whether it's the Peasant War in Germany or whether it's his excellent account of the US Civil War.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to open up for discussion from the floor now. Comrades, if you would like to come in and speak, please accept being made a panelist. But I can also just unmute you. First is Steve.
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much. Steve Lee from Firebrand in the US. Yeah, I wanted to bring up the Vietnam War in the especially the Army in the US. Oftentimes people get pessimistic and say it's hard to win over the Army to the side of revolution or anything if it's made up of people who volunteered, whereas a conscript army is more likely to be won over. In fact, during Vietnam, the leading forces in the anti-war movement in the military were actually people who had volunteered. And part of the reason for that was that they had volunteered under patriotic idea that they were doing a good thing and that kind of thing. And in fact, once they found out what was going on, they turned against the war. And that, of course, was part of the reason for that was there was a mass anti-war movement in the United States as well that impacted the military. There's a really good book on this called Soldiers in Revolt by Haymarket Books, which goes into how it was fundamentally the people who volunteered who were the basis of the anti-war movement. I think that gives us more hope that it's the political conditions that really are the basis of that. That didn't happen as much at all during the Iraq War, although there was a Iraq, anti-war movement in the army in Iraq. It was not near as widespread and didn't have the kind of impact. So it's really the political conditions that help to determine whether those volunteers in the military will go over to the side of the anti-war side, and that means it's even more important for us to build a civilian anti-war movement if we're going to impact the military. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Interesting point.
I agree.
Yeah.
Just to say, I agree completely, and to mention Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon, the great poet of the First World War, joined with full vigor the whole patriotic enterprise. He won the Military Cross. He was known to his subordinates as Mad Jack because he would actually go out on patrol when he didn't need to. He went out on patrol because he wanted to, and he won his Military Cross for seizing an enemy position single-handed, as it were. It was whilst being treated at Craig-Lockhart for shell shock that he not only wrote some of his finest poetry and influenced the poetry of Wilfred Owen, so that he wrote some of his greatest poetry afterwards. But Siegfried Sassoon wasn't suffering from shell shock. It's one of those rare cases where he was sent to Craig-Lockhart rather than be shot because he had friends in high places, or let's say he's got shell shock and pack him off to Craig-Lockhart. And during that time, his contact with his psychiatrist, one Captain Rivers, persuaded him to go back to the front. But he was completely changed in terms of his attitude towards the First World War, and fancy being sent to a psychiatric hospital because you think the slaughter of World War I is a bad idea.
Thank you. William, please.
Citizen Army is something that I would have a family connection with, being the grandson of an Irish Citizen Army volunteer. Now, the Irish Citizen Army was founded by James Connolly and James Larkin after the 1913 lockout in Dublin, where there was a lot of police brutality against workers. and they organised themselves in a defence force. When the outbreak of the First World War, the Unionists in the north of Ireland were able to get all the recruits they wanted because they had to prove their loyalty to the king. The Irish Home Rule Party, led by John Redmond, was after securing a Home Rule Act, which was supposed to be implemented but had to be shelved for the duration of the war. And to show good faith, he recruited a lot of nationalists into the First World War. Now, Connolly took the position, and he said that he was in part of the Republican movement. At that stage, he most certainly was not. He was an independent, and he was socialist and communist. And he said that no, if they start bringing in conscription into Ireland, when you get your conscription papers, turn up at a Citizen Army office and join the Irish Citizen Army and not the British Army. Now, at one stage, the actual Republicans, the IRB, kidnapped Connolly, and he was missing for the best part of 3 weeks, and then he appeared without ever giving an explanation to where he was and what it was all about. But clearly, there was after him some serious negotiations went on, because then he aligned himself with the IRB, which were the Republican movement at the time. On Easter Monday, when the rising was, when they decided to go ahead with the rising, he spoke to the Citizen Army from the steps of Liberty Hall, and he said, the Citizen Army is now disbanded, and we are now the Army of the Irish Republic. So that's how the IRA was born. He was an associate with that. Now, some of the statistics you have, I would argue against. You were very, very low in the amount of people that were shot at down. There's one thing you can give the Brits. They keep meticulous records. And if you look at their records, you will see that 601 were executed or shot at down for desertion and other things. And a lot of them were people that were suffering from, usually when they went back off leave, immediately they would desert, because they would think, what's the bloody war all about? Now, Lenin said that the Irish Citizen Army was the first workers' army in the world to go into action. And we are very proud of that. Now, I know Trotsky took a completely different view, but I'm afraid we're going to support Lenin's position. He also said about Kharkiv being part of the coming from Germany. Well, actually, Kharkiv goes back to the Boer War. The British won their empire with their famous red coats. It was a dress uniform and a combat uniform, and it was something to be respected and feared. A fellow called John McBride, who was living in Johannesburg at the time, organised an Irish battalion, a cavalry battalion. And he noticed that the Zulus used to tie bushes to their arms and legs and heads and hide in the bushes when their enemies went by. They would jump out and get them. So he decided that khaki, a green uniform with brown stripes on it, would hide them, and the British wouldn't be able to. Where the redcoats, it was like a lighthouse. Snipers could take them off, and the casualties in the Boer War were the highest casualties the British ever had to suffer, before or since. They suffered 70 to 1 casualties. And that was down to John McBride. Now, John McBride was the father of Sean McBride, who founded Amnesty International. And he wasn't a particularly nice chap. I think the feminists would call him a misogynist, and I think they'd be dead right in calling him that, because he was found debating his wife. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a good soldier. Now, he was executed as one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, which is something he wasn't. He actually joined the Rising on the morning of Easter Monday. It was a bank holiday. He was all dressed up, and he was going chasing women again, his favourite pastime. And he was all dressed up in his good suit, and he was going through Stephen's Green in Dublin, and he's seeing them setting up barricades. And he said, "What are you doing?" "Oh," they said, "we're going to have a bit of a rebellion." "Oh, are you now? Do you have a spare rifle?" "Yeah." And that's how he joined. But when the British realised who he was, they were going to make him pay for what happened in South Africa, and he was executed. It was out of sheer revenge. Now,
Okay,
as for,
can you kind of
I was just saying about George
that?
Orwell. I mean, anyone who writes a thing like 1984, An Animal Farm, after coming back from Spain, is certainly suffering from mental disease, right? It's nothing, only the height of absolute disillusionment and complete and utter nonsense. Now, will there be conscription? Yes, there will be conscription. If there's need to be conscription, the establishment will find ways of doing it. They'll take people out of jails. They'll find all sorts of reasons. They'll stop people from signing the toll. They'll do anything they want. They'll find ways of bringing in conscription if they want conscription. So don't think that there's going to be any resistance against it, because there's not, right? And where's conscription taking place now at the moment? In the Ukraine. They're even recruiting old women and old men of 60. They're going around press ganging them into the army because they haven't got enough people left. That could happen in Britain. It's just as handy. And the propaganda that we have to listen to about what the war that's going on in Ukraine is absolutely sickening. There's no question that they're trying to tell us that Zelensky is not a fascist, when everyone that has any political understanding at all knows that he's an out-and-out fascist. So that's it. There are my points. Hopefully it'll be helpful.
Got out of your chest. Thank you, William. Ian, did you want to reply, or shall I take somebody else?
I'll come back to other things. It's just a pleasure to listen to William, actually.
What's that?
I was just saying it's just a pleasure to listen to you. That's fine. There's a couple of points I'll come back to, but later.
Mark, hi.
Yeah, cheers for the talk. I must say I agree with the last speaker's final conclusion. If there's a necessity for conscription, there will be conscription. It's as simple as that. And we've seen what is possible under this government with its support for what's happening in Palestine and in Israel. And obviously in the past, as a British socialist, I've seen what they're capable of doing and read about what they're capable of doing in Ireland. This is a slight aside to what the to the main body of the talk, and relates back to why were the people unwell in the Gulf War. And I think, in truth, it has largely been established it was due to organophosphates. The Emeritus Professor Malcolm Hooper from Sunderland did a lot of work on this. At the time, it was connected also to the work of a shepherd called Brenda Sutcliffe, who had discovered Professor Solly Zuckerman's research paper, which was undertaken back in the early 1950s, which was placed in the House of Commons and forgot. And it simply said deadly poison on the front of that. She did a fantastic job, Brenda. And at one point, she had, and I had, around 1,000 shepherds who we believed had committed suicide as a result of being forced to sheep dip with organophosphates in it. And Malcolm Hooper and Brenda worked closely together, and later worked closely together with people who also airline pilots who have been poisoned in essence through the air bleed in major aircraft. And that's a campaign which Unite has been supporting pilots who are getting substantial compensation, a few £1 million in some cases. In terms of the lads that set up the Gulf War campaign, they were mainly, the main leaders of that were from Hull and Sunderland, which were prominent places where people came from and went to serve in the Gulf War. And if I recall rightly, the 6 main characters, and it's some time ago I'm speaking about now, all died before they were 50. All of them didn't see any active service actually in the Gulf War, but they attributed through Malcolm Hooper's work, and I can send you the information. I've still got it. I wrote quite a bit about it as I was learning to write professionally, was back in the Northeast at the time. So there's plenty of stuff on that. Doesn't take away from the rest of the things. What's a slight aside, and I was interested to hear the American comrade come on, is that in the United States of America, Gulf War syndrome was recognized, and compensation was given to the I think it was the regular army. And as I understand it, again, I'll have to go back and check this out. I think it was when down in Florida, when I think black voters were prevented from going to vote. Was it in the 2004 election? And it led to, was it one of the Bushes winning the election? It was those soldiers which were mobilized to prevent the black vote coming out. So there was a direct involvement of soldiers who'd been in the things. Now, one thing I've always known, and which is known by many soldiers, and I've got lots of friends of mine who have been soldiers, is that how badly soldiers are treated after they come out of the armed forces. And when I was working in London for a while, for about a year, I was working Saturdays and Sunday nights in Soho in a hostel, 147-bed hostel, and at least a third of the people in that were ex-soldiers who were in terrible situations. It was difficult to be sympathetic entirely with them because they were so aggressive that you basically had to stay out of the way on many occasions, especially on the night shift. But that has an impact generally on other people who learn that they'll be badly treated afterwards. I feel on that situation. This is I had many conversations, many conversations with ex-soldiers, and what you also find is that some of them deeply regret what they've actually done. My best mate was a servant soldier. He went AWOL after his experiences in the early 70s in Belfast. He was imprisoned and chucked out after 6 months of the army. But some of them do deeply regret what they've actually done. And however, opportunities to perhaps unburden themselves, and I'm not making excuses for people here under any circumstances, means that they're forbidden under the Official Secrets Act to actually speak about these experiences, and that makes it difficult to really come to terms with what you've actually done. There was one other point, but I've forgotten it. I'm actually doing all the ironing at the moment, so that's one of my favorite things. So I'll be getting back to that, to be honest with you. So anyway, it was a good talk. Anyway, cheers for that. And sorry I haven't been able to come other times. I've been working Thursday nights. If
you can remember your point, I can bring you back in.
No, sorry, it wouldn't be that important. It's, as I said, the points I'm making now are not as important as what's the general point, which Ian has generally been made throughout this. Anyway, cheers.
Thank you very much, comrade. Do you want to say something, or shall we take somebody else?
Take some. That's fine.
Okay, Paul, please.
Yeah, we look back to the Second World War with the Home Guard and the ideas put forward by within the Trotskyist movement and also Independent Labour Party and others, and Tom Wintringham, is related to the question of large-scale recruitment of workers to the army and the prevailing atmosphere of anti-fascism. Because a lot of people who joined the army at that time, either volunteering or armed forces, either volunteering or conscripted, saw the war as in Britain as an anti-fascist war. They didn't see it as an imperialist war. I mean, it was an imperialist war, but the reason why people joined that or willing to be recruited was because they thought it was an anti-fascist war. And what you had with what Trotsky called the proletarian military policy was an attempt to key into the anti-fascist sentiments and try to push the war in that direction. Because if you've got several million people in Britain and in the USA where you had similar sort of feelings, working class people, largely middle class people who'd often be very progressive, that is a massive force. And if you have go from anti-fascism to anti-capitalism, I mean, that is a massive force in favour of it. It wasn't like the First World War, where it was a God, King and Country war in the Allied countries. In Britain, the ruling class had to adopt the language of the left, admittedly the Popular Front left. You look at even Churchill's speeches, you can see he sort of grudgingly accepted these sort of ideas that were floating around, not in his part of the political spectrum, but on more towards the left. So there was a real potential. And I think that merely repeating the left-wing slogans from the First World War weren't sufficient. And there had to be an addressing of the fact that Nazi Germany was indeed murderous, as we know, but also that and a deadly threat to workers and minorities wherever, but you had this mass anti-fascist sentiments amongst the armed forces themselves. And I think that was necessary to key into that. That doesn't apply at the moment because, you've got it didn't really apply after the Second World War, because you've then gone for the wars that Britain was involved in after the Second World War. There's no way that any of them could be portrayed as anything sort of like anti-fascist. However, they try to make out Argentine juntas and Saddam Hussein as the new Hitlers, or Gamal Nasser for that matter. What we've got today, I think, is this. The Liberals are it's mainly Liberals, although it's right-wing Social Democrats and the Tories in Britain, not so much in America, where you've got an isolationist trend growing up around the Trumpers. The Liberals are getting incredibly militaristic. I mean, just today in the newspaper, in The Guardian, Timothy Gartnash is going on about how we must help Ukraine win. I mean, this is delusional. I mean, but the thing is, in the paper yesterday, it said 10% of the British population think that Ukraine can actually win the war. 10%, despite all the incessant propaganda about how Ukraine's doing and that. And in America, according to a broadcast I was listening to, 12% of the population think that Ukraine could win. In other words, a tiny proportion of the population, considering the amount of pro-war propaganda there's been, actually think this is going to, that Ukraine can win. And of course, popular opinion here is right. If you listen to, say, John Mearsheimer, professor from Chicago, the man who's actually had a military career before he became an academic, international relations guy, he makes it very clear why Ukraine can't win a war of attrition against Russia. And yet we're being continually entreated by, especially Liberals, that this war is one that must be supported, must be backed, and the population must get behind this. Now, what I think these military figures are speaking, now the chap who called for a sort of a conscription, he got shouted down a bit, politely, but told to, that's not the line. What I think they're aiming for is a sort of a war-mindedness amongst the population. In other words, not recruit, not conscription. They don't want a load of people who don't want to be in the army. It's a waste of time for the military machine itself. The officers don't want a load of blokes who don't want to be in the army. But what they want is a population that is more willing to accept the realities of war. When I grew up in the 1960s, the Second World War, or the last war, I still call it that, was everyone's consciousness. You know, my parents lived through it as my mum as a young civilian, my dad as a conscript soldier. Everyone had friends, relations, and that who'd been through a total war. Nowadays, how many people actually know anyone in the armed forces in Britain? Next to nobody. It's very unusual. Someone says, "Oh, he's in the army, he's in the navy." Blimey, that's unusual. What I think they're trying to do is to prepare this atmosphere of war-mindedness, that there are wars going on and you're not just a spectator to them, you're part of a whole kind of ethos around it. And from within that atmosphere, the army, the armed forces will have a better chance of recruiting from there. So it's trying to shift the kind of feelings amongst youth today, for whom war is a spectator sport, not much different to playing a computer game or something that granddad might have got involved in, you know, ages ago. But what they want to do is create an atmosphere in which militarism is more accepted, and then they've got a better chance of recruiting more people. Finally, the idea of a workers' militia today, I think, is really a bit utopian, because when you're talking about workers' militias and that, you're talking about a position of dual power. Now, the military policy, the Trotskyist ones, the ILP's one, during Winteringham, Orwell, in the last war, was about trying to shift a bourgeois army into some sort of revolutionary force, because you got loads of workers there on a progressive line of anti-fascism. There's nothing like that today. And I think talking about replacing the army with a militia as some kind of short, medium-term thing is really, it's unrealistic. It's something we, you know, maybe when things hot up a bit. But I think that is it's a bit of a non-issue at the moment, I think. Anyway, I'll leave. Oh yeah, someone just put up about growing up in the 60s about First World War. Yeah, my grandparents were involved in the First World War, you know, either as civilians or as servicemen. So, you know, growing up until sort of that, really into the 1980s and that, there was still this image of war around. It's part of a national kind of ethos, if that's the right word. But that's died out as the older generations have died out. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Conrad. Thanks, Paul. Shall I take a couple more?
I'll just come back on a couple of little things. I mean, I agreed with almost everything that Paul said, but I just would like to make this point, I suppose. There's a tendency on the part of the left to regard anybody who's in uniformed services as somehow being irredeemably right-wing or authoritarian or whatever. And if you know service personnel, you will know there's a tendency towards being right-wing and being authoritarian. That doesn't mean to say they all are. And moreover, it doesn't mean to say it doesn't change. And the history of mass armies is of changes in consciousness. I mean, the rebellions at Etaples weren't usually ascribed to an awareness of the Russian Revolution, but the rebellions in the French army were. And there's no reason to believe that at Etaples there wasn't some awareness of it as well. I agree that it's about moving to a state where we're prepared to put up with a lower rate of pay or a lower standard of living in order to pay for the next war as much as anything else. Of course, they could introduce conscription. My feeling is that it's more trouble than it's worth to the bourgeoisie. But if they could, I mean, there is some evidence that there's been some response to what is a very kind of widespread recruiting thing on Facebook and elsewhere. Coming back to one other little thing that, about Orwell and homage to Catalonia and Animal Farm and so on. Orwell's target really was Stalinism. He saw the way, I mean, he starts off Homage to Catalonia by saying that the Communist Party of Spain was on the right, not the left of the Republican forces. When he was standing on the roof of a building, of the Plume building, protecting it from the armies, the Republican army, he was saying, given a choice between knowing which side he's on the side of the proletariat, and Orwell was didn't write Animal Farm and 1984 because of a hostility to socialism. He wrote it as a hostility to Stalinism, and that was the important thing. In a sense, Homage to Catalonia is his finest work. Yeah, they could try and introduce conscription. How far will it get? Until relatively recently, a lot of countries in Europe had partly conscript armies, and how successful was it? I mean, some people don't mind. I mean, some people don't mind going away with a TA and getting paid for going hill walking. It's a different thing altogether to actually realise you're going to be shot at.
Thanks, Ian. Tony.
Yes, thank you. First, I enjoyed your talk thoroughly, and it was very interesting, Ian, about a subject I knew relatively little about. I also echo what you said about Orwell. I've always seen Orwell as particularly prescient in terms of the development of an authoritarian state, and certainly his comment in Animal Farm about everyone being equal, but some being more equal than others, I think struck a nerve, as it were, in terms of Stalinism. But I just wanted to throw, I don't see conscription as being on the agenda in the imminent or even in near future. Again, I think the ruling class will adopt it as a very last resort. But I just wanted to throw out this, that wars are also becoming increasingly automated. And we see that in Ukraine, where Russia has unleashed hundreds, if not thousands, of drones. And Israel has done much the same. I don't think it's had a very good experience of the reserve army, most of which have been withdrawn both for economic reasons and because of the casualties they've experienced. So I just thought you might want to comment on whether, in fact, the wars of the future may be wars fought between, as much as anything else, different machines, and the better technology will prevail. I'll leave it at that.
Good point.
I once met a woman in the Royal Artillery. You wouldn't normally associate women with the Royal Artillery because the whole thing was you have to pump bloody great big shells into the back of guns. She effectively went to war with an Xbox. That's what she did. She used her skills honed on PlayStation and Xbox to fly drones, because what the Royal Artillery really needs is to be able to see where the target is. And yes, and of course, artillery is so last century, except not everywhere. I mean, and one of the striking things about the Ukraine war is that it's 21st century meets almost 19th century. You've got First World War trench warfare combined with high-tech satellites being able to pinpoint targets. One of the things that Hamas fighters are up against is heat signatures. You've not only got to be bloody fast to get away from a response from IDF tank or whatever else, but you know, given that you've got heat vision, and you know, an attack helicopter can shoot through walls with no problem at all. So yes, it's very technical, and my fear is, well, my suspicion is that if there's a war with China, with and so on, that it will be at one removed. It will be somebody using an Xbox to drop some very large payloads on Chinese people.
Exactly. I mean, it just kind of depends on the war, isn't it, and what the aim is of the war. I mean, if you're fighting for territory, then you'll need to secure that territory. How are you going to do it? You need boots on the ground for that. I mean, to drop a nuclear bomb, you just need a couple of people, but that's an entirely different way of warfare, isn't it? Steve, please.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Ian, as well. That was very, very good talk. I enjoyed that. I just want to try and maybe draw a distinction, I think, between what you might call a people's army, a people's militia, and a workers' militia. Because I think you need to separate them, because often they get mixed up sometimes and we start talking about one or the other. So I think a people's militia, a citizens' army, citizens' defense force, whatever you want to call it, you know, whatever, really arise out of the defense of an area, defense of a community, even the defense of a nation. By and large, it's to defend people for defending themselves. Whereas a workers' militia, I think, probably comes from the defense of the picket line, people say, you know, and a workers' militia is more likely to be a socialist, is more likely to be, I mean, a people's army could have socialists in it, but it wouldn't be socialist. You know, a Republican army, if you like, wouldn't be necessarily socialist, whereas a workers' militia may or may not be, but it's more likely to be socialist in its ideas. And of course, republicanism was always opposed in the past on principle to the idea of a bureaucratic, professional standing army, which was associated with the monarchy, and that was Marx's position. If we go back to the program of the German Communist Party in 1848, for example. So there was always an opposition, regardless of whether they were about to arrive at socialism or the working class was about to take power. That Republican, and it goes back, of course, to the Roman Republic, because in the early days, the Roman Republic had a citizens' army when it was a republic. It was basically farmers who got tooled up, went off for a few months, then came back to their fields again. It wasn't a professional army in any sense. It was a people's army. Later, of course, when Rome became the empire, somewhere on the line in that transition, the imperial legions were really a professional army. They went away for years and probably never returned home for 2 or 3 years or whatever on a stint, and they were out there to get as much as they possibly could. Completely different things, but that was the difference there. Goes back to the ideas of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. An imperial army has got to go abroad and conquer other people as opposed to defending the people. And I was thinking of our own example. I was thinking of the Battle of the Bogside in August 1969, when thousands of residents of the Bogside district organized themselves into the Derry Citizens Defence Association, and they fought off the RUC, they fought off the B Specials, they fought off the Loyalists. They defeated the Loyalist mobs that were attacking them. They set up barricades, we had stones, they had petrol bombs. And they were so successful that the British Army, eventually the RUC had to be withdrawn and the British Army came in instead to take over because the RUC had been defeated. And then Derry became a kind of a no-go area. It was called Free Derry. And so almost like a people's own area until October. It was ended in October 1969. So it only went on for a new month. But here we have an idea of the people getting together to defend their area against fascists or orange or B specials or whatever, you know, that sort of idea. So I think that if we're talking in those terms, then it isn't possible that we want to argue as socialists if we're not ready for a red army at the moment where things are, but we may want to say we don't want this professional standing army. We should be opposed to that right now, and we should be in favor of a democratic people's army, citizens' army. I won't go on about Ukraine. I think there's a whole argument there, but look, we're getting late now, so I'll stop at that point.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Shall I take Matthew as the last speaker? Yeah, and then you can reply to both. Hi, Matthew. I think you're unmuted already. Oh, no, you're not. It's not working. We had the same problem last week, but we managed.
Yeah, no.
There you are. We heard you. We heard.
Yeah, is that the...
Yep, go ahead.
Right. Okay. I think there is an issue with this. I do agree. I think mostly with what Paul said. There's, you know, obviously, you know, what they really want is to militarize the society if they can, because obviously it requires a huge sacrifice on the part of the mass of the working class in order to pay for this stuff. You know, and the problem that they've got in Ukraine really is the fact that they can't, the NATO powers, the Butchers Alliance, are not equipped to fight a prolonged war. I mean, what the wars they've been fighting up till now, the likes of Afghanistan or Iraq or any of these other wars, are relatively low level and can be fought from existing stock of ammunition, etc., rather than a proper war of attrition as is happening in Ukraine. And they simply don't have the manufacturing capacity, because obviously most of it has been privatized and so on, sent out to capital. I mean, if you look at what happened to you know, the Royal Armaments in Britain, I mean, they've offloaded it, so effectively all the capacity is gone. You know, and if you look here in Glasgow, the last job done by the big Bishopton plant out in Renfrewshire was to supply Saddam Hussein. It was working its arse off from that, and then they shut it. It's now a housing estate. So they just can't, I mean, the simple problem they've got is they just can't manufacture enough artillery shells or any of this other stuff that they require. And so, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that obviously there simply aren't enough people in Ukraine. I mean, most you know, the sensible ones fled the country, you know, when they could, when it started. And actually, of course, every time they say, well, we need to conscript more people flee, you know, because why would they want to get, you know, ground up in this? You know? So the problem, that's really the problem they've got. I can't see that they, you know, and the other thing, of course, in terms of Britain, of course, is you know, historically, there have been areas where, you know, working class kids go into the military, but the problem is, of course, they get treated so badly that essentially they've destroyed that culture. You know, the British have always got this historical thing; they always treat their squaddies and so on, and very, very, very badly. And so, I mean, eventually that gets through, and people just, you know, and of course they messed up everything anyway. So I really don't think they can conscript to that degree. The problem they've got, as I say, is the manufacturing issue. And in terms of Ukraine, I mean, the thing is obviously that you've got, you know, there are these changes in technology, and you can play. I mean, the likes of the Yugoslav wars, the Serbs, I think, discovered that, of course, if you take the door off your microwave, it has a heat signature very similar to a tank, and therefore you can put a load of these things around a bit of the place, and it saves a bunch of your real tanks. So there are all these games you can play with all these detectors, and obviously in Vietnam, you know, all sorts of methods of trying to baffle detectors of one kind or another. The problem the thing is, what you've got, of course, is that a lot of, I mean, the likes of, say, artillery now, of course, is all mechanized. You haven't got people feeding shells into the back of a gun. You've got a machine that feeds shells into the back of a gun, and the machine is mounted on a track or a set of wheels, and you wheel it in there, and it automatically shoves out, you know, however many rounds you plug into it. So the guy can control it, can be, you know, 3 miles away or whatever else, sitting with his Xbox, and you know, fire off all these shells in the direction of, you know. And the issue you've also got, of course, is that with the drones, is effectively what it's done is it's eliminated, you know, the basis of having armored vehicles. course, because all you can do with drones, of course, is you can drop these armor-piercing projectiles, or you can fire the drone through the tank or wherever it is, and so it really creates this issue. So in those terms, it gets more and more technical. And this also, of course, is a problem for in terms of conscription, because obviously as armies, I mean, the issue with having people's militia, whatever else, is actually the whole basis of actual military practice and doctrine and so on and so forth is increasingly technical and increasingly requires, that experience and taking on, the past and so on and so forth, and an ability to control these very complicated, build these very complicated machines, which is not something you're going to get, from fighting on a housing estate or whatever else. So I mean, it's going in the opposite direction, and it is then also, of course, going towards automated, AI machines which will go around and kill people, which is the next thing. Obviously the ruling class wants to do this, but they don't want to say to people, "Look, we'll have a fleet of machines, and they'll come around and kill people," because obviously that there'll be an outcry against that, rightly so. But that's the way they're going, and you can see, I mean, the likes of Google and so on and so forth all have divisions that are building these type of machines for killing people. So in those terms, it's going to get interesting. But the problem they've got, of course, is to persuade the working class. Well, their living standard, the mass of the population has to go down substantially. Well, they can do these things, and that is going to be their real problem.
Thank you, Matthew. Very interesting discussion, everybody. Thank you very much. Ian, if you want to reply to a few things and perhaps sum it all up, that would be marvelous.
So I don't agree. I don't disagree with any of what Matthew said. I think there's currently the Royal British Legion, which has an interesting history in its own right. It came into being to prevent soldiers becoming politicised after being discharged after World War I. And it's currently having a campaign for people to sleep out in the open in March, in solidarity, as it were, with homeless ex-soldiers and the like. Well, why the hell are they homeless? Although the pay isn't great, there's not many people in the armed forces that are starving or whatever. You could argue that they're not well equipped to deal with civilian life afterwards, and not well paid enough during their service time, unless they do the full 22 years and then they get a decent resettlement grant and that kind of thing, and a pension and so on. But if you're going to do 3 years and then come out, then you're not necessarily going to be equipped with very much, particularly. You're right, they don't treat them very well, particularly. Obviously, it's considerably better going in being an officer, but it obviously depends what you're going to do. What I found interesting from my experience is that the people who have the greatest difficulty are the people who join the logistics corps or something like that, and they spend their time as a cook or a driver or whatever. Largely move from one unit to another and so on, and there's a relative lack of cohesion. And those are the ones who tended to turn up at the military medical centres complaining of anxiety and depression and those kinds of things. Or put differently, all the pressures that exist in the armed forces are exactly the same as for the rest of the population. The armed forces are not a separate population. And even if you allow for the fact that we have an entirely volunteer armed forces, they're not a separate population, just as the police are not a separate population. The overwhelming majority of them come from what we might broadly call working class backgrounds. I don't necessarily mean, they're all going to be politicized or whatever else, or inclined to be left wing, but their experience isn't terribly different. It was very noticeable in the miners' strike, and people who've been watching the series on the miners' strike recently will have observed that the police had to be used from London Metropolitan Police, who were usually paid better anyway, and moved up to Yorkshire or wherever else because they knew the people they'd been to school with in the police, and they'd been in the police because they didn't want to go down the coal mines and so on. But they nevertheless lived in the same village, lived in the same area, the same county at least. So breaking up, using, I mean, it was another feature, for example, of the great truce of Christmas 1914, when British and German soldiers got out of the trenches and started fraternizing. Robert Graves, in Goodbye to All That, which is a magnificent book. Robert Graves was commissioned in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers before subsequently going on to become a great poet and writing I, Claudius and so on. Anyway, in the Royal Welsh, he remembers men firing off whole belts of ammunition just to boil water for tea because they didn't actually want to shoot anybody. They didn't want to shoot Germans particularly. They recognized they were in exactly the same position as them. And so the High Command recognized that there was collusion going on between the British and German forces in Christmas 1914. And so consequently, they moved soldiers about so that they couldn't get to know the people in the regiment, in the German regiment, in the trenches opposite. They moved them about, and they arbitrarily shelled even when they didn't need to, even when it wasn't for an attack, to break up any kind of possibility of colluding between supposedly enemy forces. And we all seem, lots of people on the left seem to think that revolution is some kind of thing in the far, far distant future. And, in the meantime, the ruling class thinks it's just around the corner. And is deeply concerned about whether you can have enough of an army to even keep the working class under control. This is why I argue that we should fraternize with uniformed service personnel at every opportunity and not regard them instantly as the enemy. I agree with the idea that we're being invited to embrace a military economy where we have to take lower standard of living in order to pay for weapons and so on. But it's not lost on anybody, I would suggest. And next time, we're told there's no money for the NHS, but by the way, we need another war with the Houthis or whoever else, I don't think it's lost on anyone. My feeling is that there is now, for the first time in a very long time, a worldwide movement. It's disparate, it's inchoate, but it's firmly and resolutely able to see the naked reality of Israel, the United States, Britain, the worst imperialist countries of the world, and is able to make those connections. Whether that then turns into a movement that can make a difference is down to people who are politicized enough to make any kind of commitment to the left whatsoever. And I think now now that Starmer has completely revealed what he always was, apart from when he was a Trotskyist, of course. Apart from no one can surely have any kind of illusions in the Labour Party, and I think that the next few years will be very interesting. One of the other great military writers, apart from Clausewitz, of course, was Sun Tzu, and as he observed, if you sit on the riverbank long enough, you'll watch the bodies of your enemies drift by. And on that note, thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you very much, Ian. It was a great session. Thank you for doing such a great presentation, and thank you for your comments and contributions, comrades. Really good discussion. I think we're actually, a lot of us learned new things. Our sessions are always very interesting when we have a debate or something, which we're going to have next week, for example, but this was a very educational session as well. Please join us next week. We're going to look at the solution. What is the solution in the Middle East? We're going to have somebody making the point for a one-state solution, two-state solution, socialist solution, federal republic. So there's going to be different points of view being put forward, hopefully with some kind of resolution, perhaps. At least it'll educate and entertain our audience and probably shed some light on the horrific situation in the Middle East. Thank you very much, comrades, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. Bye-bye, comrades.